Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you again to Arlo, to the seminar, to all of you for being here. It's really already been a remarkable weekend. I was saying to a friend last night, I feel a little like, George Plimpton when he wrote that book about the NFL by going to train with the Detroit Lions. Because I'm someone who's been drawn to the Caribbean really all my adult life and have been engaged in certain ways and have tried to write about this part of the world in a way that honors its culture. But many of the people who really inspired me and drew me to this part of the world in the first place are here this weekend. So it's really a remarkable weekend, a remarkable achievement to bring so many important figures from the Caribbean into one place. And we owe Key West thanks for that, so thank you. I'm here to talk a little bit about my book, Island People, but more so to talk about the ideas it tries to put forward about the Caribbean, not merely as a rich and complex and interesting place, but as a place that really, to my mind, belongs at the center of any story we tell ourselves about the making of the modern world in all kinds of ways. And I'll talk about why. And then I'll read a little bit from the book. So the Caribbean, or the Caribbean if you like, you hear it both ways all across the islands. I get asked often, how do you pronounce it? I say, however you like. The Caribbean, of course, the etymology is very interesting, right? The name comes from the name given to one of the indigenous groups on the islands at the time Columbus showed up, who were said to be cannibals, said falsely to be cannibals. But the Caribbean was meant, right, to evoke the sort of savagery of the place, the wildness of these islands. But the Caribbean has had this sort of extraordinary history since over those 500 years. And my book, in trying to think about the Caribbean, to offer a portrait of the Caribbean, of each island in turn, its history, its culture, has been about to think about the Caribbean not merely as a place, but as an idea. And I think that all of the best travel books, the travel books that I care about, the works of history, the works about place that I am really turned on by, are books, as I say, that think not just about place as a thing, but as an idea. And the Caribbean and Caribbeanness have been a potent idea in world culture, I think, for a very long time. These days, right, sort of as a place to go on vacation, beautiful beaches, as you have here in the Keys, right? But the Caribbean, to me, as I say, is really central to our culture, to our history, in ways that I think have been undercredited and that we need to pay more attention to. I'm often asked, when I'm asked to talk about this book, sort of what it is. And I'm always intrigued when I go in a bookstore to see where it's shelved. Sometimes it's in history, sometimes it's in travel. I remember the first event I did for it at the Miami Book Festival, you know, it was sort of a travel writing panel. And of course, when you say travel books, I think of two things. One is you think of, you know, the sort of guidebooks, the sort of Fodor's or Lonely Planet, and say, here's where you eat, here's where you stay. Clearly that's not exactly what I'm up to here, though I have some, if you read close, there are some sort of recommendations in there where to hang out. And then also, of course, there's a history of another kind of travel literature, which is this travel literature that's in many ways a kind of imperial genre. It was very much a kind of writing that came out of the sort of age of European empires, of especially French and English travelers, right, traveling off to the colonies to write about these strange, mysterious places and come back and talk about what they found. There's a lot, of course, about that genre that to us would read as problematic, to use that word. There's also a lot of important literature that came out of it. Two of the books that I sort of am in conversation with, certainly, in the ways in which I write about the Caribbean, in conversation with partly to show how a kind of writing about these islands is outmoded at this point, but nonetheless that I'm in conversation with, are two classic books from the middle of the 20th century. One, Patrick Leigh Fermor's The Traveler's Tree. Leigh Fermor, known as sort of one of the real greats of the British travel writing tradition, very much a sort of aristocratic figure who wandered around, immensely erudite, charming, great writer of prose sentences. And he sort of wandered the Caribbean right after World War II and wrote a book that remains an important portrait of the islands just before they became independent, right? And then another is V.S. Naipaul's, The Middle Passage. Naipaul, of course, grew up in Trinidad, but moved to England, and I think in many ways, right, took on the sort of mode of the British travel writer and tried to write in that idiom in all kinds of ways, with a sort of interesting inside slant. To my mind, though, one of the things that joins these two books, and they're both still worth looking at today, right, is that both of them approach the Caribbean as marginal, as this place that, oh, this is interesting. There are these people who, you know, have steel bands and they sing calypso songs, and there's this history of sugar, and there's this brutal history of race and racism. But these places are not necessarily important, right? Naipaul went so far in his book to say that nothing of importance has been made in the West Indies. Now that was partly he was just trying to sort of stick it to where he was from, right, in his kind of Naipaulian way. But I think that for me, one of the important things about writing about and engaging with the Caribbean today is essentially to show how deeply wrong he was about that. Not in the facile way of, oh, nothing was made, but to say, not only have things been made there, but things that have been made there that are absolutely essential for us to understand this country, to understand our moment, to understand where we are on the planet today. So that's part of what I try and write about in my book. Now this fellow here, though, this is the guy who, for me, became the kind of muse or guide for me in what I tried to do in writing about the Caribbean. He wrote one of, I think, two books. If I were to recommend two books of nonfiction to anyone to start out reading about the Caribbean, one would be C.O.R. James, The Black Jacobins, which I'll talk about. Another, I think, certainly is Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place. It was a great thrill to see her here the other night, to be here with her this weekend, because I think that book was generative, not only for me, but I think for so many people over the last few decades about what it is to come from a place that is so used to being viewed from outside in particular kinds of ways. And I think it just demands to be engaged with and has inspired a lot of what I've tried to do in the islands. But C.O.R. James, this fellow here, this is his sort of matinee idol phase. When I first encountered him in college, you know, there's a great sort of collection of his essays where he's there with his snow white hair, looking like this sort of sage. This is in the 1940s when he was living in the United States. James was born in Trinidad in 1901, died in London in 1989. Was an amazing writer of not only fiction and drama. His book Minty Alley is often regarded as the first Caribbean novel in English to be published in London in the 1930s. But then he wrote a book called The Black Jacobins, also in the 1930s, which he revised later on. And it's a book about the Haitian Revolution. And there's a lot of great books about the Haitian Revolution, a lot of important histories. Some of the scholarship has been updated. But I think if you're going to read a book about the Haitian Revolution, this is the place to start. It sort of reads like a novel. The story, the drama of the Haitian Revolution is an incredible, just human drama, among other things. But in this book, in The Black Jacobins, and more particularly in the new edition that he wrote in 1963, not that he wrote, I should say, that he added a new essay at the end of it. James made some arguments about the Caribbean and its importance that really are immensely important to me and I think should be important to anyone who thinks about the region. And what James said in the 1960s about the Haitian Revolution and about the Caribbean in general were three things in particular. And it was quite radical, I think, for him to say these things in the 1950s. It would have been quite strange. He essentially contended that the Caribbean was uniquely placed to shape the future of world history and world civilization. I think people must have looked at him quite sort of strangely in the 1950s hearing that. I happen to think he was entirely right, as I'll get into. But his contention that this was so was based on three things. The first thing is that these islands, the islands of the Caribbean, were really the center of the triangle trade, of the slave trade for 3 centuries. In the US, we tend to think we're the center of all things good and bad, so we think, oh, slavery was sort of centered here as well. It wasn't. Of the 10 million enslaved Africans who were brought from Africa to the New World, 6 million were brought to the islands of the Caribbean. The other big center, of course, was Brazil. Here, something like 400,000 before the advent of the United States. But in any case, because the Caribbean was the center of the triangle trade, the Caribbean belongs at the center of the story we tell about the birth of capitalism, the modern world, modern trade. All of these things are really centered in the Caribbean in all kinds of ways. The wealth that was created on the plantations really gives birth to modern economies in Europe. Second is the Haitian Revolution, the importance of the Haitian Revolution. And I think it's only really in recent years that a lot of historians have caught up to what James was arguing a few decades ago. People have been, wow, yeah, that is a fascinating story. The only time a colony of slaves launched a successful revolution. People have been interested by it, but people haven't credited the ways in which it really shook world politics in all kinds of monumental ways. I think that Haiti, and I should say, given the news of the last few days and the sort of cretin we're forced to listen to, that Haiti is, contrary to what he has to say, is an extraordinary place full of extraordinary people that everyone should visit. But not only that, the Haitian Revolution, I think, is in many ways the birth of modern politics. It's this moment when people with dark skin say, this notion of universal rights, this notion of human rights, this notion of the Enlightenment, does it apply to us? Does it apply to all people? And I think those people asking that question 200 years ago, is still something we're contending with today. Haiti, of course, was really punished for declaring its independence. It was saddled with unpayable debts. It was marginalized by the United States, which didn't recognize it for decades. So they're still sort of paying the price for that heroic set of actions a couple centuries ago. But I think that the Haitian Revolution, as I say, just belongs at the very center of the story we tell about the history of the last couple centuries. And third and finally, James argued that the people of the Caribbean from all of the islands were, as he put it, uniquely placed to shape the future of world civilization and culture. And he said so for a few reasons. As I say, I think in the 1950s that would have sounded crazy to a lot of people. But he said, look, these people, we think of certain things as uniquely modern, as unique to our era of history. The mixing of people from all over the world, long-distance trade, people learning different languages. He says, listen, these people in the Caribbean, in the islands, for example, where he grew up in Trinidad, they've been dealing with this stuff for centuries, right? These places were born of international trade. They were created by people being brought from different continents and thrown together and having to figure things out. People from Africa learning European languages and having a sort of unique way to engage with those languages and to create something new. And so essentially he said, the Caribbean is where it's going to be at. In the 1950s, he was saying that. In my view, 50 or 60 years later, I think he was absolutely right about that. You get a star for picking up someone here who's actually here this weekend. Dear Edwige up there. But my view of that, I think there's a lot of ways to look at it. In the 1950s, people might have thought of the Caribbean as these sort of backward colonies, as these places maybe to go on vacation. Air travel and cruise ships were just starting. But in the decades since, if we think about the impact of Caribbean politics, political thought, so many of the leading thinkers in sort of Pan-African political movements, in thinking about the end of colonialism across the world, came from these islands. Frantz Fanon, Césaire, James, Fidel Castro, for better or worse, was this great hero in the Third World for some time. But then we think about music, right? And one figure in particular I think we can think about very easily as sort of having shaped this story is that, right, 35 years after his death, Bob Marley, the guy up here on the left, right, is arguably the most visible, pervasive political and musical icon on the planet. There's nowhere you can go where you don't see this guy's picture up in a coffee shop or painted on the side of a building or you hear his music. which is a remarkable thing in its own kind of crazy story. Harry Belafonte, the first platinum-selling LP in history, 1956, right? We can all sort of hum the songs. I won't do so up here. But right, it's an amazing thing. It's like he bumped Elvis off the top of the charts and stayed there for 35 weeks, which is an amazing thing, singing kind of ersatz Caribbean songs. But then we think about literature, right? And we think about the ways in which Caribbean letters have really shaped certainly our literature in this country, but across the world. I have up here a book that I'm particularly fond of, Brown Girl, Brown Stones by Polly Marshall, which still isn't read enough, but to my mind this is a book she wrote in the 1950s, a woman from Barbados, and it's really, to me, in a lot of ways, the start of what we think of and talk about now as the immigrant novel, right, which is such an important part of our literature here in this country, with good reason. This is a country of immigrants, as we need to remind ourselves constantly. And so I think that there's all kinds of ways in which Caribbean literature, Caribbean culture, Caribbean politics, as I say, belong at the center of how we think about our culture. And this is all, I snuck this in. If I were really on it last night, I would have found a photo of all of us hanging out or something. But I wanted to say, I think that there's a way in which this gathering actually, I think, marks a really new and exciting boom in Caribbean literature, which is partly about the sort of strange ways in which publishing moves, that there are moments when sort of a bunch of fancy publishers get excited about a writer and then sign a bunch of writers from that part of the world. There was a moment in the 50s when the Caribbean had a moment. There was another moment sort of in the 80s for a minute. But I think now there is this amazing flourishing, which I should say is not about, oh, all of a sudden there's talented people. No, there's always been talented people. But there's a way in which a visibility has happened, partly because of some folks earning deserved prizes and other people being published. But I think that the ways in which literary history works, right, there needs to be moments and things that are legible, and I think we're in one now, and it's a very exciting thing, and many of those people are here. So another reason to be grateful to Key West. What I'm going to do by way of closing is just give you a couple of snippets from my writing about the region. As I say, the impetus for this book was to offer a portrait of these places, of their richness, of their complexity, and of their history. But to do so, I've always been interested to make the geography of the place about encountering people, right? And not necessarily about encountering the sort of foremost people, the famous people, because any journalist can tell you, sometimes a celebrity interview is the most worthless thing you can do, right? It's often about finding the people who were proximate to the people who made the headlines, right? And so that's very much what I've sort of tried to do in this book. And what I'll do is give you just a couple of tastes, one from Cuba and one from Trinidad. The Cuban bit, it's amazing how quickly this stuff changes. This was just 18 months or so ago that I was writing about. Of course, this was this moment when this opening was happening, this changing of the relationship between the US and Cuba. That all seems to be kaput now for the moment. But this essentially just describes being in Havana, a place that I've gone to for 20 years, when all of a sudden there were a bunch of Americans walking around. It was very strange. I've been used to being, oh, there's some Canadians and Germans, but I was like the gringo on the scene. But all of a sudden, lots of Americans, which was interesting in all kinds of ways. Not least because how it was shifting Cuban culture and society, which of course is undergoing a sort of halting but monumental transition right now. So I'll just put you on the ground in Havana, Christmas time, a year and a half ago. 2 years ago, I should say now. What are we, January? 2 years. The most profound change in the months after the announcement was the palpably larger presence of foreigners, and Americans especially, striding Havana's streets and filling its hotels. With American Airlines having announced the resumption within months of frequent direct flights to Jose Marti International Airport, there was also a vibrant sense among many of those foreigners that they'd arrived here just in time, less to see Cuba before it was too late than to get in on the ground floor of what was coming next. At Swish new restaurants in Miramar and Vedado, nightclub owners from Los Angeles rubbed elbows with Manhattan art dealers. London hucksters proposed new hotel ventures, and a critical mass of movie stars and sundry other representatives of the self-consciously hip took selfies in a city whose uses as a backdrop had been strongly evinced the month before in a Vanity Fair pictorial shot by Annie Leibovitz that found Rihanna posing as a prostitute in central Havana. It was impossible not to hear from one of those characters at one of those establishments they frequented about the various spectacular homes or seaside apartments they'd been shown by realtors in a town where selling property to foreigners was still in most cases quite illegal. At a great rumba gig I'd been attending for years in a weekly midnight set in a small club above Miramar's Casa de la Música, the usual crowd of Cuban rumberos and hustlers were now joined in the front row by a well-known blonde movie actress from LA. It was hard not to feel like Havana was coming full circle to the 1950s, when every Hollywood starlet and Manhattan wag with a yen for color and rhythm came to Havana for their kicks. One evening on the newly redone veranda at the Hotel Telegrafo, a middle-aged man who I at first mistook for a sex tourist sat down one table over from mine with a pretty young Cuban woman. When the woman left a few minutes later, he informed me in Russian accented English that she was a lawyer whom he'd retained to advise him on changing real estate laws, and then summed up his appraisal of Havana just now. Is like Russia, 1986. Real estate was one thing, but other prospecting already happening on a bigger scale pertained to the problem of that single wire to Venezuela through which Cuba got its internet. Just weeks earlier, big US telecom companies and venture capitalists alike had exulted in Obama's announcement that they'd soon be allowed to enter the Cuban market and perhaps even join it by cable to Key West. The subtext of this excitement was the hope, mirroring the monopoly-like frenzy that attended the end of the Spanish-American War, that US firms might again dominate the dormant Cuban market. Of course, what all this rather blatantly ignored was that whatever changes Cuba allowed, or economic reforms Raul Castro effected, it was hardly likely that anyone in power here would consider, let alone rubber stamp, any form of foreign investment not set to benefit either Cuba's ruling party or themselves. Where this was all heading was hard to say, at least for now. The Russians' mention of 1986 implied its own timetable for how long Cuban communism might last. The larger direction of the island's opening economy and its cultural scene as well may not have been set to follow what one artist told me with regard to the government's plodding yet significant steps to date. You can't melt one corner of an iceberg, he said, without letting the whole thing go. It was also plain that many Cubans, not least the ailing but still alive Fidel Castro at the time, remained strongly determined to uphold both some semblance of sovereignty and the better-loved aspects of its socialist system. But what made things especially hard to judge at this juncture was that Raul Castro's retiring form of leadership had only grown more retiring in the past year. After he announced that he would cede the presidency when his term ended in 2018, his general approach to governing and to narrating for his people the reforms he was quietly enacting vis-a-vis the United States and otherwise was to issue quiet communiques and announcements in the state newspapers. In Havana that Christmas, there was a visible dearth of any new propaganda billboards and a visible rise in Christmas decor and other bits of capitalist kitsch, long anathema here. The hope that Cubans might still affirm the revolution's ideals may have remained, but the aim of retaining their blind faith in its rhetoric seemed at last to be quietly exiting the stage. When on New Year's Day Raul didn't deign to give a speech, it was anything but a surprise. What perhaps lay in wait for Cuba, though, if the new contradictions weren't managed well, was suggested in a drama that unfolded in the Plaza de la Catedral on New Year's Eve. Not 3 months later, Barack Obama would arrive in a rainstorm with his lovely family to visit this, one of old Havana's prettiest squares, as he readied to give a speech in which he proclaimed, "I'm here to bury the last remnants of the Cold War in the Americas." But on New Year's Eve, a large group of well-heeled tourists was promised a night of dinner and dancing under the stars. Nothing was necessarily amiss about this on its face, but in a city and a neighborhood where free access to public space has long been sacrosanct, especially on a night when habaneros greet the new year by washing water from their homes and walking their neighborhood's blocks at midnight. The organizers of this event, clearly in some sort of cahoots with local authorities, had taken the unwise step of barricading off the square. The streets of Old Havana have, of course, been no stranger for some years now to wealthy foreigners rubbing up against some of the city's humbler citizens, but this marked something new. For the cool price of US $200 per person, an amount equal to what people in the surrounding apartments earned in a year, guests in the plaza were to enjoy the superb backdrop of Old Havana without the bother of its locals. Their night began well enough, but it took a fateful turn when those wealthy tourists went to leave the square to board their air-conditioned tour buses. The one exit from the plaza, they found as they went to leave, was blocked by a few dozen angry locals accustomed to hanging out here whenever they pleased. The locals snatched at the little paper bags full of party favors that the tourists were toting from the square. An angry crowd, doubtless tipsy on New Year's rum, began yelling obscenities as well. The police arrived and, sensing a serious situation, unleashed a German Shepherd. Many of the Cubans dispersed, but one of the dogs managed in his ardor to knock over a small elderly man who belonged not to the crowd of locals, but to the bag-toting tourists. A woman in the latter camp, witnessing the incident, grew so frightened of what lay beyond the square that she refused to leave. When her tour's minders finally convinced her to go, she walked with some friends back to their bus, but they were accosted by 5 or 6 local young men who demanded their bags. When one of the group's Cuban chaperones confronted the boys, he punched him. Everyone made it home eventually, relatively unscathed, but by night's end, at least 2 of the older women in the tour group were shaken and hyperventilating at the sight of any Cubans, and at their own old fear and unrest and upset being again loosed on the Havana night. So that's Havana just now, a couple of years ago. As I say, and now to close in a sort of celebratory note. This is just a little passage, actually at the very end of the book, about a dear friend of mine in Trinidad who passed away last year. He was a guy called Jay Telfer, who was notable for a few reasons, but one of them is that he helped start the Notting Hill Carnival in London. He was sort of the guy who helped raise the money and convince the police that it was okay. He was sort of the guy behind the scenes. And the Notting Hill Carnival, of course, is based on Trinidad Carnival. It's now remains the biggest public street party in Europe. Over 1 million people come out, people from the islands, but people from everywhere in all backgrounds. Of course, there are other carnivals like this, right, across the world now. In Brooklyn, Labor Day Carnival, which is the biggest yearly public event in New York City. Toronto has its version. And I think that there's something remarkable about the ways in which these traditions from the Caribbean have become the sort of sign under which people have figured out how to let loose or mix or dance or all these sorts of things. And of course, there's a deep sort of history behind that, a history of turning the body into an instrument, not of labor, but of pleasure. And Trinidad, of course, has this incredible carnival, steel bands, many of which are up to 120 people playing on these drums the steel drums, by the way, that they got from the US naval base that was there during World War II and turned into musical instruments. It's an amazing thing. You have to go to Trinidad at some point and hear a full steel pan orchestra. Because of course they tour, but you can only bring 10 or 12 people. You can't bring 120 people. You could, but it would take a lot of money. But anyway, there's nothing like that. And Jay was a guy who had a nightclub in London. It's called the Ambiance. He had a resident steel band there. It was in Notting Hill. He was also a guy who wore a uniform every day of his life the last 30 years. I call it a uniform, it's just what he wore. But he wore a red turban, this white sort of bespoke tunic, and these black pants, and which made him a walking Trinidad flag, if you know the Trinidad flag. I asked him once, I was like, Jay, what's up with the turban? He was a light-skinned black man, what's called a red man in Trinidad. He said, I met this Sikh guy in London, back in the 60s, and he looked just like me, and the turban looked so good. And I asked him to show me how to do it, and I've worn it every day since. Which was very Jay, gives you a sense of him, but also very Trinidad to me, right? This notion of creating oneself as a character is a place where performance is immensely important during Carnival and otherwise. So this is Jay Telfer, and this is just the last months of his life. During the last months of Jay's life, I had the good fortune, while spending a semester in Trinidad as a visiting scholar at the university, of living in Jay and Ruth's spare apartment in Cascade above Port of Spain. 86 by then, Jay had slowed down a bit, troubled by shortness of breath, not helped, no doubt, by his insistence that copious ganja smoking wasn't part of the problem. He'd spend most of his time sitting down, and his favorite line to quote was from Tagore. "I have scaled the peak and found no shelter in fame's bleak and barren height. Lead me, my guide, before the light fades, into the valley of quiet, where life's harvest mellows into golden wisdom." Still, though, he was liable to leap up when the mood struck and demonstrate how his uniform's black leather belt had a utility beyond the sartorial. "You see," he'd say as he wrapped its length around his palm and whipped it out, "an assailant can't get near. I just give licks." He's 86 years old by now, right? Down at the pan yard, he was still good for a few suave twirls before taking a seat. During the evenings, though, as we sat on the patio drinking coconut water, he kept his TV tuned to the arts channel and rhapsodized about the exquisite playing of Andres Segovia or the exquisite plie of some bygone dancer in the Ballet Russe. Retiring to my own quarters next door, an airy flat decorated with the art of Bosco Holder and of Jay's brother Henry, I often worked late into the night and would hear Jay shuffling around on the wall's other side. He'd always kept a nightclub owner's schedule. "You and I know the magic hour," he'd say. One night when we both went to sleep rather earlier than dawn, and while Ruth was away on a visit to New Zealand, I awoke to hear rapid breathing from through the wall. It was Jay, unable to catch his breath. Rushing him into a car, we drove at 3 a.m. to Mount Hope Hospital outside Port of Spain and checked him into the ER, beneath a sign reading, "Gunshot and chop wounds this way." With a little oxygen and a half hour or so hooked up to one of the breathing machines with which asthmatic kids from the nearby neighborhood were also catching their breath, he was soon okay. But when a couple of weeks later, 2 young kids robbed us both at gunpoint on Jay's once peaceful block, his trusty old German shepherd, Raja, was soon to be put down himself. He snoozed through the whole event. It seemed the writing was on the wall. The kids with their pop guns, taking account of this mixed-race crew, including a man in a turban, had said as much when they asked, "What kind of people you?" Jay replied, "Trinis like you, brethren." When early the following spring I got an email back home in New York that Jay had passed on, it wasn't a surprise. Nor was the word that his funeral, which I couldn't get down for on short notice, was an occasion to best all, with a great funeral pyre by the Caroni River and Hindu rites accompanied in perfect Trini fashion by Orisha drummers and flower petals and great wafts of incense smoke rising to the heavens. The last time I saw Jay, though, wasn't on his porch, nor was it on Port of Spain's streets, even though it was Carnival Tuesday and that stage to the street dramatist par excellence was a second home. Having taken ill days before, Jay had checked into Port of Spain General. He'd been unable to wave the flag for his beloved Phase 2 steel band during Panorama. I asked him once why it was called Phase 2. He said, "We're far beyond Phase 1. I said, "All right. That explains it." What little of Carnival he'd caught was through his ward's open window by the savannah, across which I walked to visit him, dodging last-lap revelers on Tuesday afternoon. But propped up there in bed, Jay was utterly himself, quoting Tagore and Julius Caesar, charming nurses he called sister, trading verses from old midnight robber songs with an ailing man one bed over, whom he called my true partner. As he lay there, perking up as the sounds of a passing steel band drifted up from below, his turban was still in place, his tunic impeccable. And when I remarked on this, he didn't miss a beat. "You know the other reason I dress like this," he murmured, "it's so that when I'm coming, you know I'm me, that this man here is different from the rest." We knew, those who knew him, and I thought, walking out of Port of Spain General and past a little eatery called We Foods, that maybe I knew something about why he could only have come from here, too, and nowhere else. Thanks.